the Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network presents Worldview Media Podcast, where Gordan and Joyce Runyon view popular media through the lens of the biblical five-point covenant model to help believers appreciate and apply principles of exciting narrative and engaging storytelling.
All right, welcome to Worldview Media Podcast. My name is Gordan Runyon, and I'm your host today with a face made for radio and a voice made for pantomime. And I'm here with my friend on the phone, John Steinreich. Hello, sir.
How are you?
Real good. I wanted to have Brother John on the phone and interview him a little bit because of his profession. And how would you describe what you do in the music industry?
Well, golly, the thing that I usually say to people is something that is a little off color. Have you ever seen Adam Sandler in The Wedding Singer?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, in a less grotesque way, I'm sort of like that. I've been playing live music for many, many years, and I typically perform at weddings and parties and things like that. So without being quite as gross as Adam Sandler, that's what I do.
All right. Yeah. All right. And how long you been working as a musician professionally then?
I professionally started about 25 years ago, and it's not my full-time job, but it's something that I pursue pretty energetically. And my wife is also a singer who performs professionally. And so sometimes we perform together, sometimes separately. We've also done a little foray into musical theater, where we produced a musical theater piece where we composed the music and did a show run a couple of years ago. And we're hoping to be able to put that back up in a revised format next year.
All right. That sounds exciting. Hey, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because you strike me as a bit of a Renaissance man. And I mean by that, if I understand it right, back in 2001 when we had the 9/11 crisis, your response to that was that you wanted to know more about Islam, and you didn't take the kind of normal expected route of going to the Christian bookstore and finding a book on Islam. You kind of went a different direction. And tell our listeners what you did there.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you asking because it really was a life-changing moment for me, 9/11. What struck me about 9/11, not the sheer ferocity of the violence, but the response to it that I saw from the media and from the professional government resources was essentially to downplay the gravity of it and the impact of Islam in bringing the event about. I think I had sort of a strange route of kind of getting there because my Christian background came sort of out of left field as well. My ethnicity, I come from a family that is Eastern European Jews that emigrated to the United States in the Great Wave during the Golden Age, so the beginning of the turn of the century. And so they were all, Eastern European Jews, and my grandparents, were not tremendously religious. So religion itself was not a big factor in my upbringing, but we had the cultural trappings of it. When I got to my 20s, I sort of had an existential crisis where I didn't know where I was going in life. And the long story short is I found Christ, or perhaps better stated, Christ found me. And I became a Christian in a non-denominational congregation where I've been since 1994, actually. So I was converted to Christ out of, a ethnically Jewish but non-religious background. And my introduction to Christianity was very biblically based. That is, I was encouraged to study the Bible for myself, learn about Jesus for myself, and make an informed decision myself about whether I believed what the Bible was saying was true. And really what happened in my conversion process was that I was the picture that I saw in Scripture was dramatically different from the presentation of Jesus that the media would tell you, or that the denominational world would tell you. He wasn't, that angelic sort of blonde-haired figure who spoke in hushed tones, but he seemed like a real rugged individual, sort of a strong guy with a tough personality who stood up to religious leaders and political leaders and told it like it was and didn't shy from it and hung out with hung out with people that I was kind of hanging out with. I was a musician, so he was hanging out with the underbelly of society, and the Church of Jesus was dramatically different. And I learned this early on in Christianity. That okay, the presentation of religion is not necessarily what the media. That's not necessarily accurate.
Right.
What's more accurate is if you actually go to the source book, you find out for yourself, and then you make a decision. So here was 2001, 9/11 happens, and I have a very distinct memory of the terrible event itself, and then President Bush going on TV in front of Congress about 10 days later, he said, Islam is a great religion. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
It's a religion of peace, essentially. That was the mantra. It's a wonderful thing. It's some bad guys did some bad stuff. We're not at war with Islam. It's a religion of peace. And so I scratched my head and I said, okay, well, I look at this event. Here are 3,000 of my fellow citizens having their coffee break or taking an airline flight. Just got incinerated by some guy who claimed that God told him to do this. Right. But the President of the United States and the media is telling me, no, it's not. Don't worry about that. It was just the bad actors who went off the deep end and we'll clean it up. So I thought to myself, well, the media told me one picture about Jesus. Let me go and see if the picture of Muhammad is the same. I should be able to open up the Quran and look in it, and I should be able to corroborate what they're telling me in the media, if it's actually religion and peace. And so I did. I sent an email to CARE, the Council on Islamic American Relations, which is the locust certain advocacy group in the country. I got myself a very thick Quran, a massive tome, and officially sanctioned one, translated by a guy named Muhammad Assad, who actually was a Jewish convert to Islam.
Wow.
And it contained the English version, which I can read, from Arabic that I couldn't, which makes it official that the Arabic text is there. And then it had a phonetic version of the Arabic into English Roman characters, right? So you could actually read along.
Oh, yeah,
You could see where you could sound out where jihad was, or mujahideen, or whatever it was. I read through this very thick book, and the picture I started to get was not the same as what I had been told in the media. So I read that. It was very arduous. It's not a book that I recommend for light reading. You read the Bible, and it's kind of interesting because it's got a nice historical context to it, and it's got poetry. It's got wisdom. And the Quran, to me, feels like opening up the mind of a schizophrenic, quite honestly, because it is all over the place. There's stories of biblical figures, Moses, Adam. They're just dropped anywhere in the book. And then there's lots of commands: do this, do that, don't do another thing. And then lots of threats and warnings about you better follow Allah, or you're gonna be burned in hell, and have all these horrible things happen. And it's very decontextualized. But the overall thrust of it that you get when you read it is that no, there's not a whole lot of piece of it here. There's elements of it that you can see there are passages that sort of mimic the Bible. God's really God is mercy, God's light, and so on. God is a sustainer. But then there's lots and lots of commands: kill the unbelievers wherever you find them, which is the verse of the story, Quran 9:5, and many other commands and mandates to go to illicit things in the name of Islam. And then after concurrently, while I was reading that, I was getting texts that support the Quran. Your listeners know that the Quran is similar to the Bible in that it's the holy book of Islam. There are several other books that they consider canonical.
Sure.
There's a collection of literature called the Hadith traditions. And these are little anecdotes of the life of Muhammad, because the Quran itself doesn't contain very much at all about him and his life.
Right.
And so I these, and then there's a book called The Star, which is a biography of Muhammad. It was written in the 9th century, and it's a birth-to-death story of his life. And then there's another book called The Reluctance of the Traveler, which is a 13th or 14th century manual, a legal manual, where they basically take the Quranic doctrine and they put it into a legal code. And so basically you put these pieces together, and after several years of studying this stuff, it occurred to me that, when President Bush made that comment, it's a religion of peace, and then Obama went off in June of 2009, and he said, Islam's not part of the problem, it's part of the solution to getting world peace. I said, this is nonsense. This is not true at all from a doctrinal standpoint. The doctrine itself does not point to this. The vast majority of the doctrine of Islam says, the Muslims are the best, the rest of us are the worst. And if people don't convert, they have a choice to either killed or pay a subjugation tax. And that's sort of the doctrine of it. And in that process, I felt that I have to try to put this down for Christians to understand. Because I see so many brothers and sisters in the church who have no clue. They don't understand the first thing about Islamic doctrine. I thought, let me do a comparison and contrast and write this down, what I understand from the Bible as compared to what I understand from the Quran, lay it out with my best exegesis, and give people some, say, okay, these are what these two religions actually teach from their source books, not the nice Muslim guy who's the grocer down the street who's a wonderful fellow. Yeah. But what do the books actually say? And you make the choice.
Right. And what I really appreciated about that was there was something about the way you thought that you weren't ready to just accept kind of easy answers. And And so the conclusion to all this searching, and kind of why I wanted to talk about it, is that you wound up writing a book on what you had discovered in your research. And I will tell you that we got into contact sometime shortly after you had written the book, and right before I got into contact with you, I had read Dr. James White's book called What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Quran. And you contacted me, I think, and turned me on to your book, and I read it. And I gotta say, just being honest, I would much rather recommend your book than Dr. White's. And I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read his or
I know I haven't. I've heard the name though, but thank you. I'm honored with the encouragement like that. Thank you.
Well, yours seems to be very much more kind of street level. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Dr. White's book, except that it's extremely dense and kind of hard to get through. If you really believe every Christian needs to have this information, it seems like you ought to try to write at a kind of every guy sort of level. And I feel like you've done that. And so,
thank you.
Why don't you tell our listeners where they can get a hold of your book?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the title of the book is The Words of God, The Words of God. The Bible, the Quran, and how they are lived in the post 9/11 world. If you're on Amazon, you can Google my name, which is John Steinreich, and the last name is spelled Steinreich. So it's there in paperback format or Kindle format. And then I have a web link where I'm a self-published author, so I use the Lulu.com website for publishing my own work. And I have an author's page there, which is Lulu.com, which is LU.com /.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a break up there. We'll, at the end of the podcast, we'll make sure we get those links out again.
Sure.
And,
okay.
We're going to take a short break now and get a word from our sponsor, and then we will come back, and I want to talk to John more specifically in line with this podcast in terms of what it means to be a Christian in the music industry. And this is Worldview Media Podcast, not just movie reviews or book reviews, but we also want to talk a little bit about music and creating good art for the sake of glorifying God. So we'll be back in just a moment.
The Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network brings to you a complete lineup of podcasts where you will hear practical and tactical theology. Our desire is not simply that you consume our shows, but that you also live out your faith in every area of life. We can talk all day long about these things, but if we fail to put them into practice, then we fail as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, our King. Subscribe now to your favorite Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network shows, or you can subscribe to the Reconstructionist Radio Master Feed, where all of the content we produce, including the audiobooks and audio articles, will pop up as soon as they are available. And don't forget to visit reconstructionistradio.com to volunteer as a narrator or to partner with this ministry financially. May the Holy Spirit stir you into action for Christ and His kingdom.
And we're back. I'm with John Steinreich, and the worldview media that we're going to talk about is the medium of music and working in the music industry. John, I want to tell you that I ran into a brother who works in the video game industry, and he said that it was kind of an eye-opening experience for him to realize that he can glorify God as a video game creator without having to make kind of like VeggieTales video games or something like that. He can actually glorify God just by making the best darn video game there is and by telling a story that comports with a biblical worldview. Doesn't have to be an explicitly Christian thing. And I'm reminded of a quote that I see from Martin Luther. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but the gist of it is that the Christian shoemaker doesn't need to sew tiny crosses on his shoes to glorify Christ. He glorifies God by making great shoes. With that kind of in mind, I want to ask you, what thoughts are on your mind in terms of what it means to be a Christian in today's music industry?
Well, I'm interested. It's encouraging. We were thinking on the same pattern, so I printed out some thoughts about Luther because I believe he was onto something that is correct. That when he talked about vocation as an expression of one's Christianity, for me, I look at doing music as a way of serving. It's a way of giving. So, it's not so much over in worship music, obviously, that I do. So if I go out and I'm performing for somebody's wedding or their party or whatnot, so what I'm bringing to them is joy. They want to hear something. They want to get up and dance. They want to have a good time. They want to celebrate. And I think that joy is an element of God that we don't, maybe we don't put too much into practice, or we think about it in a different context than what it actually means in real life.
Right.
So when God is a God of love, a God who Jesus is known to have celebrated in the gospel with people at the wedding banquet, and I can't imagine that he was some dour chap. He wouldn't have been so. I can't imagine the disciples would want to hang out with, Scrooge.
Right.
They just wouldn't. Human beings don't want to hang out with a party pooper. So, in that way, certainly, worship music should be, I would think, joyful and has a purpose and a place. If we're gathering with the specific, explicit intent to worship God, okay, well, then let's pull out music that lifts people's spirits, and the lyrics themselves help us to sing out to God. That's wonderful. But when we get out into the world at large, not everybody is a Christian. Not everybody is gathering specifically for that purpose.
Right.
How they want to have a good time. So I am, as a Christian myself, have to come into that experience, and I'm a representative of Christ when I go into there. I don't divorce my Christianity from my vocation. I know how to play the piano. I know how to sing a little bit. I know how to put a band together and play a tune that makes people tap their feet. Well, that to me is as godly as, going up to them and, preaching the gospel directly to their face. If I can actually elevate their spirit, I'm actually moving them towards Christ. And there's a saying that's been attributed to Francis of Assisi, which is sort of a misuse, but in our modern vernacular, we say, preach the gospel and use words if necessary.
Right.
And what Francis actually said in his rule book in 1221 was, "Let the brothers, however, preach by their deeds."
Oh yeah.
So when we're out and about doing whatever it is that we're doing, if I am a shoemaker, let me preach the gospel by being the very best and making the very best pair of shoes that I can.
Right.
If I'm going to make someone else's life better, isn't that what Christ? One of the things that He came for.
Sure.
In my context, when I'm out performing and I'm giving somebody some joy, let me do it with a whole heart, and let me be happy that God has granted me a talent to put a smile on somebody else's face and make their day even better than it was before.
Sure. Well, that gets me thinking in terms of the second great commandment about loving your neighbor as yourself, and I guess in a lot of my thinking about arts and media and what it would mean to serve Christ in that, I have to confess that's kind of a fresh idea for me, that you get into this both to glorify God and to be of a service to your neighbor, and to love them through your artistic expressions. And that's kind of a neat idea for me. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly it. I was looking at an article today by a writer named Gene Veith, V-I-T-H is his name, and he wrote, and he was talking about basically Luther's idea, and he quotes a guy named Gustav Wingren, who's a Swedish theologian who wrote on Luther. And what he says is, in his vocation, man does works which affect the well-being of others, for so God has made all offices. Through this work in man's offices, God's creative work goes forward, and that creative work is love, a profusion of good gifts. So, I mean, you can see that Lutheran idea that, what God put the creativity, God Himself as the creator, He puts that creativity in us as images of His creation, and He allows us by the working of our hands to do good works towards others. So, what challenges me so much, Gordon, about our modern society, something I've struggled with as a Christian, is the compartmentalization of our faith.
Oh, sure.
Separating our Christian life from the rest of the world, or the rest of our life.
Yeah.
And the idea of, and I've heard, when rock and roll music came out in the 1950s, they called it devil's music and so forth.
Right.
And maybe there was something to that. I don't know, but it's rather tame. If I listen to Elvis or Chuck Berry today, it's quite tame.
Right. Yeah.
That's on MTV now. But really, I think that's reflective of sort of a Christian compartmentalization. Okay, if you do music, it's only supposed to be this kind of music for this kind of purpose, and don't you dare take it out anywhere else and do anything else with it, because you're just opening the door for Satan to tempt you.
Right.
Okay, well, why should that be? If I'm a performer, I have the gift of being able to play something that somebody enjoys, lets them get up and move a little bit, puts a smile on their face. How is that ungodly? I mean, unless we're singing, really nasty, raunchy stuff and encouraging people to, truly to dive into sin headlong, I don't see how that's so wrong.
Right.
I don't.
And I'm kind of glad you mentioned that. I'm sitting here trying to anticipate what our readers are going to be thinking as you're talking, and the question that came to my mind is, well, a lot of those secular songs are, they're purposely glorifying sinful activities, and what do you do with lyrics like that? And from what you just said, it seems to me you're not talking about throwing away discernment, and you're not talking about compromising your morality for the sake of singing a dopey song. So apparently you are still talking about using some Christian judgment about what you'll sing and what you won't.
Yes, exactly. There are certain things that we intentionally change lyrics on because it okay, it's pushing the boundary.
Right.
It's not appropriate. And there are themes of songs that I've actually made recommendations to clients who have said to me, you know what, you and I are from the same generation, so you probably remember a song from the early '80s by Rick Springfield called "Jesse's Girl."
Right.
Okay, so yeah, my band has played that in the past. It's just I can't be rock and roll song about a guy who's like, he's in love with his best friend's girlfriend. He's struggling with that, right?
Right.
So I recently had a client who asked me to play that at his wedding, and I said, well, I'm not sure that that's the right theme that you want. You know what this song is actually about. He hadn't really thought about it.
Right. You just married a girl, and now you're gonna dance to a song lusting after somebody else's woman.
Lusting after somebody else. And when we had a conversation. He said, yeah, you know what, you're right. That's probably not the right thing.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so we scratched that one from the place. So that to me is an element of discernment. And then there are things that we absolutely won't do. My wife and I, and when we're performing, we'll make a choice that, I'm not going to add that particular song to the playlist.
Yeah, right.
So if we hire a DJ to work with us, like we're going to ask him to scratch, this particular artist or whatever,
right.
Because it's just pushing the boundary. And yes, we want to represent God, and we don't want to, we want to be in the world, but not of the world.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a more theoretical question, and it's something that's been on my mind, and I'll tell you before I ask it that I don't really have an answer. So if you don't feel bad, well, I'm just wondering what your immediate thoughts are. But in the field of philosophy, and I know you've done some reading in history and philosophy, and that's part of your Renaissance man work. Some of the ancient philosophers were big on the triad of virtues of goodness and beauty and truth. And it occurs to me as a Christian that we have the standard for goodness and truth revealed in Christ through the scriptures. And so there's no room for us to say that goodness is subjective. We're all about, no, goodness is God, and he's not changing, and truth doesn't change, and there's an objective standard. But then when you get to that last bit of the triad and you start talking about beauty, our culture is so convinced, and Christians are so convinced that beauty is almost completely subjective. And so any crashing sound or buzzsaw or something like that can be part of beautiful music, according to a lot of folks. And I just wonder what you think about the philosophical idea that there is some music that is more inherently beautiful than others because God has got to be the objective standard of beauty as well as of goodness and truth. Does any of that make sense to you, or what do you think?
It does make sense to me, and I wrestle with that personally because I have two kids that they're ages 11 and 6, and they really like hip-hop music.
Oh, right.
And I listen to this, and I can't understand it. Well, I mean, I can understand why in some ways, but I listen to it, and I'm like, I just don't. It doesn't resonate with me at all. It's disjointed. It's atonal.
Yeah.
It's often vulgar, and like, man, I don't get it. But then I think back 35 years ago when I was growing up, and I was pulling out my Doors albums or Jimi Hendrix or whatever I was listening to, and my dad, who was a real jazzer, he likes Oscar Peterson and Thelonious Monk and dudes like that, and I would be playing rock and roll music, and he would have the same look on his face and same attitude, saying, "What do you like that for?"
Right.
And all I can remember saying was, "Dad, I don't know, I just like it." And my daughter says, "Yeah, I don't know, I like it, I dance to it."
Right.
So there, I wish there was an absolute answer. I think that personally, I think there are things that are more beautiful than others when, melodies work in a certain way.
Yeah.
They create a feeling in a person of elevation. And then there's stuff that just sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard.
Sure,
But then
right.
again, to the next guy, it's, hey, that's the coolest thing that they've ever heard. If it's uplifting, if whatever it is doing something to make a person aware of good things and
Right.
divine things in some way, I guess we have to say that it would fall in the category of beauty. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I'd be with you. I think every generation kind of seems to have its own tastes and preferences, but I'm wondering if that is all just if that's just a cultural slide or something like that, and I guess I still struggle believing that beauty really is objective, and music is beautiful music is objective. I think I was listening to a book from Martin Selbrede, and he was talking about Johann Sebastian Bach, and how Bach was kind of convinced that music itself is a language like any other, and
Yes.
and that the highest purpose of any language is to communicate the glory of God and to preach the gospel. And Bach, apparently he explicitly knew that's what his calling was to glorify God through music. And he's writing symphonies that don't have any words that you can listen to, no lyrics, and still convinced that he's communicating something about God in that. Does that ring a bell, or does that make any sense to you?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It absolutely does. In that, music in itself doesn't necessarily need to have a lyric to it in order to convey something of God, because you can hear a beautiful melody and be moved to tears by it.
Oh, yeah.
Bach was, in my view, he was a genius certainly of his time. It reminds me of something that I read by J.I. Packer. What you were just describing, and he did an analysis of charismatic Christianity and the modern version of speaking in tongues.
Oh, right.
And he likened it to scat singing.
Oh,
Ella Fitzgerald.
right.
When you listen, Ella Fitzgerald to me was a brilliant vocalist, tremendous skills at being able to place lyrics, and she had a beautiful tone, and just she was very charismatic of a performer.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
Her biggest, her niche was scat singing. And scat singing, it's basically you're soloing as if you were a trumpet player, right? You're running a melody as a soloist, but you're not saying anything per se.
Right,
but you're
right.
attempting to evoke some emotion in the listener.
Right.
And Packer compared that to modern speaking in tongues, that this is an indiscernible language. But the person who's doing it could very well be speaking something from their soul, spiritually.
Right.
Maybe they understand, God understands, who knows. They're getting out in a way that is indiscernible.
That's interesting.
I thought it was a really interesting take on it. So maybe there is certain truth to your idea that there's objective beauty, or there's objective goodness in music. When it evokes something deep and profound and good in one's soul.
Right. Right. Okay, let me give you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let me give you a last challenge here. I want you to imagine, if you will, a Christian teenager who knows that he has a musical gift. He taught himself how to play the guitar, or he's learned how to play the trumpet, and that's his love, and that's what he wants to do. That's his passion. But he's a Christian teenager, and he does want to glorify God, but he's hearing things, especially in my community, the Reformed community, he's hearing things that kind of make it sound like if you're going to serve God vocationally, that's going to mean things like full-time ministry or writing a book or, something like that. Is there some kind of word of encouragement that you can give to that teenager who may not ever sing a lyric in his life, but he knows that he has a God-given talent to play an instrument? Does that mean he has to find a worship band to be part of, or just give some pastoral counsel to a guy like that?
Well, I'm going to go to Scripture and let the Scripture do the talking to answer that question.
Great.
There's two things that come to mind. Colossians 3:23. I'm reading from the NIV version. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So the first thing is the self-examination to make sure that he's working with his whole heart for God first and foremost, and not for human masters. And that would include, even churchy people, shall we say.
Right. Right.
People who have sort of a disposition to say, no, you really got to do it in a worship music fashion. You can't do it in a secular or quasi-secular manner. The first thing would be he's got to be clear in his mind and his heart that he's doing it for God and for godly purposes first and foremost,
right.
Not for human beings. It's God ultimately that he's serving. And if that means going out and he wants to play in coffee shops and elevate people's night, make them feel better and earn his bread from getting tips that way, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Right.
I'm going to go to Ephesians in chapter 4. Verse 29 says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. So,
wow.
I would say, in addition to the words that we speak, when we're playing music, it's the same thing. We want to bring out of ourselves that which is helpful for building others up according to their needs.
Right, you're loving your neighbor. Going back to that,
loving your neighbor. Think about that coffee shop on a Saturday night, right?
Yeah,
that's not a church setting, but there might be a person who's sitting in there lonely and sad because of whatever's going on in their life, just hanging out, and a musician comes in and sings a song or plays a song that elevates that person's spirit,
right,
and makes them feel a little bit better. Maybe they go up and they start talking to that guitar player and asking him, what's his inspiration? What are you doing? And it would give him a perfect lead-in to actually share the actual gospel.
Sure. Yeah.
By speaking to him. And if it doesn't happen, if that person's night is made just a little bit better, then to me, I think they've done the work of Christ.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, before I was in Christ, I was in those sorts of places, and man, there really are times when you might walk in there really bummed out about something that's happened in your life, and sitting in there with some good music that, and I say that from a secular standpoint, from some well played music that is joyful in its own right, and man, I'm convinced I've seen people's lives kind of be saved from hearing a decent song played well, even without hearing the gospel. They, maybe they walked out in a radically different mindset than they came in, wondering why they go on and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember when I was in college, I was not in a great space, but, I was 20 years old and just, kind of a reckless guy. I wasn't going anywhere. I had plenty of periods of depression. I remember having a vinyl album of a group called Boston and listening to that and listening to the guitar solos on there. And that was something that would help me get through the night. I'm like, I really like the way the guy was expressing himself through this particular guitar solo. It hit my soul in a certain way to pick me up from where I was. So maybe I would take one drink that day
right.
because I had a vinyl album of something that lifted my spirit.
Yeah, exactly. If the guy doesn't make it through the night because he's killed himself, there's no more chances to hear the gospel after that. And
exactly.
The Christian ER doctor may never talk to his patients, but he's still serving God by saving their bodies and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, I don't want to keep you very long. I know you've got other stuff to do. The busy Renaissance man that you are, and I really appreciate the time that you've given to us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
And let me ask you again. Okay, the book is called "The Words of God," plural words, and people can just find it by typing that into Amazon or finding your name, John Steinreich,
Yes.
and
Scott. Mm-hmm.
And
you
then
use my name, it's faster to find.
yeah, and spell that again for him.
The last name is spelled Steinreich.
Okay.
And I actually have, I wanted to give a direct link. I have a webpage on lulu.com, and the full page is lulu.com/spotlight/JDS bookstore. And those are my initials, John Daniel Steinreich.
Okay.
Bookstore. And I have the Words of God there. And I also have my new publication, which I haven't done much promotion on, but it's called A Great Cloud of Witnesses. And that's some essays that I've basically on Reformed theology.
Great.
And on a variety of different topics that I think people will be very interested in. And I'm going to attempt to do some more publicity on that in the months to come.
All right. Well, let me know when that's fully up and running, and I'd be happy to. First of all, read it. You're an easy writer to read. I appreciate your heart and all those things, and I really think that Words of God book is very helpful, and I've recommended it several times. And,
thank you.
And so, John, thank you very much. My prayer is that there's somebody out there hearing this that will be encouraged that, I can make that living in music. I can use this gift, and I don't have to sew little crosses on everything. I can just be great and serve God this way. And I'm convinced you've probably been a great encouragement. I've loved your answers. The whole notion of art being done for the sake of loving your neighbor, that's a great takeaway for me. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I do hope that I've been able to provide your listeners with some benefit. And anybody who's out there as a musician, I strongly encourage them to really just look at it as something of a godly pursuit. It really is a blessing. I can't tell you how much joy I personally get when I'm able to perform for people. It's really a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. So I'm going to sign off and say this is a Worldview Media podcast for this week, and we're all about encouraging our listeners to extend the kingdom of Christ into the area of arts and entertainment. And John Steinreich has been my guest, and we're very thankful. So go out there and serve God in whatever capacity He's gifted you. Amen.
Thank you for listening to the Worldview Media Podcast. Please visit reconstructionistradio.com to check out the other podcasts in our network and to download our free audiobooks.